Longer-term outcome data from new lipid-lowering agents, known as PCSK9 inhibitors, were awaited with interest.
I think it's important to realize that PCSK9 antibodies are one of the first new lipid-lowering drugs that are becoming available in a relatively short period of time. Although statins have been crucial in reducing risk in patients with cardiovascular disease or high risk for cardiovascular disease, I think we all can agree that there is still a large number of patients that are insufficiently treated despite having optimal or maximum statin treatment, and that having a new approach available will make it possible to also manage and reduce risk in these type of patients. The program that I'd like to discuss with you is the Odyssey program. They studied PCSK9 antibody alirocumab, and the period they studied was for approximately 78 weeks, looking at safety and predominantly also looking at efficacy parameters. And in this particular subgroup of the Odyssey program, FH patients constituted a large number of patients within this study. This is the largest cohort that has ever been studied so far in a large clinical outcome trial. There were more than 1,270 FH patients in this study. What looks like a very favorable outcome, I'm not going to go into all the specific details, but overall there was a really robust reduction of LDL cholesterol of between 65-75%. More patients were achieving goals. With the statin treatment, this was an add-on study, so most patients were actually already on high-potency statins or even dual therapy with an add-on lipid-lowering agent, like, for instance, ezetimibe, reaching goals, and goals could be 100 or 70, depending on the risk. Between 60 and 70% of the patients were actually able to achieve that goal. And I think that is quite exceptional. We compare that, for instance, with the control group that were only using the statins or combination treatment. Those digits were only single-digit numbers, so that was a huge step forward. What is interesting, although, in this trial, that if you look at the type of patients included, you can see a good divide between males and females. Average age was around 57. But what was really striking is that 95% of the FH patients that were included were Caucasian whites. So I think there is still a huge challenge in finding FH patients in other regions of the world. In terms of safety, I think there were no particular issues in terms of muscle safety and particular muscle symptoms. The incidents were actually quite a bit lower in the ones that were treated with alirocumab, roughly about 1.6%, versus roughly 5 to 6% in the ones that were only using statin or a combination treatment with a statin. So I think this is again a step forward in the program of showing us the evidence how efficacious and safe this form of treatment is, and I think it looks quite promising. Another of the PCSK9 antibodies is evolocumab. There was also a large program presented here at the meeting where they looked at patients with side effects on statin treatment, and also approximately 1 year follow-up of a combination of approximately 10 different trials that were combined, and again a similar picture emerges where you can see efficaciousness is more or less the same as with alirocumab, and also the safety profile looks very, very promising. With evolocumab, there's an issue maybe in the future of dosing. Should we dose it once every 4 weeks, like with alirocumab, or should we perhaps do it once every 2 weeks? That's also being evaluated. And that might present us with different treatment options in different types of patients. I think these were probably the most poignant items that were discussed. There were quite a few other posters and presentations, but more or less in a similar line, where we saw that it's a very promising new treatment. There's a lot of excitement among the trialists, but also among the cardiologists here, that we have this new compound. And I think so far, quite in contrast with what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years with a number of lipid-lowering drugs like ACAT inhibitors, squalene synthetase inhibitors, niacin, MTP inhibitors that all showed unpromising results, particularly in safety. This is the first time after statins we have something that is really promising and that could help us to address that need in, for instance, of heterozygous FH patients.
There was news of new device therapies too, with data from a phase 2 study with a leadless pacemaker.
Any new hope from, say, EP or pacing?
Yeah, well, EP and devices is my area, so it was quite encouraging to see a couple of promising studies there. The one which got a lot of attention among the audience was the Leadless 2 study. So Vivek Reddy from Mount Sinai in New York presented the results of this. So this is the St. Jude NanoStim leadless pacemaker inserted via a femoral approach, and it offers VVI pacing. And this was an observational study, and it's more to look at the feasibility and the safety of leadless pacing. And they found that at 6 months following implant, 90% of patients had adequate pacing. Safety's been a concern with the leadless pacemakers, and they still had about 6 to 6.5% patients having a serious adverse event, and a number of those included a cardiac perforation. Vivek Reddy mentioned that obviously some of that may be due to operator experience. The majority of participants, the majority of implanters in the trial hadn't put in a leadless pacemaker before. And just like we've seen with appendage closure and biventricular pacing, the complication rate tends to fall as people learn the procedure. So there is promise yet. The other question is what happens long term with these devices when it comes to battery change. I mean, we're quite far from that, but what approach do you take in those people?
Coronary intervention is a fast-growing area. Bare metal stents are now being tested against a bioresorbable vascular scaffold.
In the field of coronary intervention, I think the major topic at this Congress has been the kind of emergence of bioresorbable vascular scaffolds as a kind of next generation for percutaneous coronary intervention. These essentially are scaffolds that contain a drug and elute a drug, much like drug-eluting stents, but over time they get absorbed into the vessel wall and restore essentially normal vascular physiology of the wall. And there have been a couple of studies presented at the hot topics here which have kind of trying to look at its feasibility and safety. We've got the Trophy 2 trial which enrolled about 200 patients having ST elevation, acute coronary syndromes, and randomized them to either having drug-eluting stents or these bioresorbable vascular scaffolds. And then at 6 months had looked at both clinical outcomes and also angiographic outcomes, looking at imaging, intracoronary imaging, and found that there was a non-inferiority between the two populations at 6 months, which is very promising to think of its long-term use. And then secondly, there was a Japanese study called Absorb Japan, where they took about 400 patients and they followed them up after an elective PCI, again either randomized to either a drug-eluting stent or these essentially bioscaffolds, and at 12 months looked at both clinical outcomes as well as angiographic data and found that again that these were non-inferior. So in general, although conceptually they are very attractive, given that you're left without the coronary artery without any artificial material left in it, there is no advantage to using the biovascular scaffolds at the moment, but there's potential that they don't do any more harm than current procedures and could potentially in the long term be proven to do benefit, but we're not quite at that stage yet. We've seen the Optidual trial, which looked at patients a year following stent placement and either randomized them to a total of 48 months of dual antiplatelet therapy or to continue on aspirin monotherapy. At the end of this observation period, they found that the people who continued on dual antiplatelet therapy had a similar composite endpoint of both bleeding and ischemic endpoints compared to those that had been on aspirin alone. Now, I don't think that this globally changes what we should do to patients that we see following PCI, but it kind of gives us a freedom to individualize treatment and say that actually if you are particularly worried about any ischemic complications in a patient that has undergone PCI, they're not necessarily going to be at any added harm by extending the period of dual antiplatelet therapy. So I think, that's another kind of interesting concept that's coming out.
And while spironolactone looks set to change the guidance for the treatment of resistant hypertension, its use in MI patients without heart failure looks less promising.
If we're just looking at drug therapy for ACS, there was the Albatross trial where they took patients who were having an acute coronary syndrome and randomized them to either standard care or therapy with a mineralocorticoid antagonist, namely spironolactone. This was a negative trial and didn't show any difference between the two groups, apart from potentially a benefit in the STEMI subgroup, but that's yet to be proven. And so I don't think this will change our management apart from our kind of well-established treatments in this group of patients with heart failure who have an ACS, who we tend to put on a eplerenone.
Yeah.
And I think the STEMI group will require some further investigation.
While a new high-sensitivity troponin test looks promising for speeding up the triage of STEMI patients in A&E.
In terms of logistics and how we go about diagnosing ACS, there was the BAC trial which came out of Germany, and this was essentially looking at pathways, and what they did was using high sensitivity troponin, used a 1 hour collection point, so high sensitivity troponin taken 1 hour after the episode of chest pain, and they found that if your high sensitivity troponin was less than 6, you had a negative predictive value of 99% and sensitivity of 98% to rule out MI.
Yeah.
So I think this will, once further validated, probably filter down into clinical practice to help us rule out MIs a lot earlier, but we'll probably have to do some more work to ensure that we accurately diagnose MIs.
There's going to be an epidemic of troponitis.
Even more troponitis, but I think we can use it essentially like a D-dimer, where we can say that a negative high sensitivity troponin early on rules it out as a diagnosis, but doesn't necessarily rule it in, and we can hopefully develop new pathways.
Each year the ESC publishes the Congress proceedings online, so log on to www.esccardio.org to find out more about these and thousands of other studies. You can also find there the 5 new ESC guidelines published during the meeting. So after another very busy and newsy meeting, it was time to pack up and go home, reflecting on what we have learned and how this will change our practice. Until next year. See you in Rome.